Suella Braverman lost her job as Home Secretary for demonizing peaceful protesters and provoking a far-right riot at the Cenotaph. But she hasn't given up her role as Britain's agent provocateur-in-chief. On Thursday, she went along with GB News to try and get a reaction from Cambridge students protesting against the Gaza war. This is what happened.
My view is that there's a very brutal conflict because Israel is defending itself against a death cult called Hamas, which runs Palestine and which is intent on eradicating Jews in Israel from the face of the...
I've got a few people here. Now, quite often you'll see that they don't seem particularly intent on showing their faces. I don't know if you might be able to engage with people. Hello. Just wondering if you'd like to have any kind of discussion at all with Suella today.
Hi, I'm Suella. I'm keen to find out your views and what you're protesting about.
Nothing at all? No?
Interested in why you're covering your faces. Is it a COVID or a health measure? No comment.
No. Can I just ask, are you students at the university or just from around the area? Nothing? No? Fine. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. And what were you expecting? You know, did you think that maybe people might engage a little bit with you? They feel very strongly.
Well, these are supposed to be some of the brightest and the best students in the land, and taught in the art of articulating their views and expressing arguments in a coherent way. And I'm interested in hearing their arguments.
Yeah. Anyone?
Engaging and listening.
What would be your main question to some of the individuals?
I'm really keen to hear what your message is to Israel.
No. Nothing.
Interested to hear your message to Hamas.
No comment. Okay.
Do you think the hostages should be released now?
What reaction
No.
Is there?
No,
Hey, we keep walking.
Not very...
Don't know if you would like to have a quick chat with us, sir, at all today?
Hi there.
Go on.
Very nice. I'm Suella. Can I ask you what your message is to Israel?
Yep.
Right?
She, by the way, at the beginning of that clip said, Hamas who control Palestine. Right? She doesn't, she's sort of made it her job to be this real loudmouth on the conflict, doesn't seem to know anything. Right? Of course, Hamas are in control of Gaza. It's Fatah that are in control of the West Bank. Obviously, those students, I think, rather intelligently decided that they didn't really want to rise to Suella Braverman's bait. It made the whole thing look a little bit like a kind of Alan Partridge sketch. While the students didn't want to speak to Braverman personally, though, they did give a statement to the student newspaper. It's quite good. We are a movement that focuses on our university's link to the genocide currently taking place in Gaza. There are people being deliberately starved in Palestine as we speak, and our university has a role to play in this. We refuse for our movement to be used as a tool for an irrelevant person to gain any political relevance they lost, and we will not engage with them. Aaron, it was an entertaining video clip. I'm sure GB News won't be unhappy with it because they sort of just wanted to get something that looked mildly entertaining, but they obviously didn't manage to get a headline out of it, which, you know, they would have wanted to have smeared whoever they spoke to, presumably. Do you think the students made the right decision to sort of say, we are not going to engage in this, we're not going to speak to Suella Braverman?
I think so. I mean, you know, plausibly, you could have had somebody give a virtuoso explanation as to why she's wrong and completely humiliate her. Of course you could. But that's hard and things can go wrong. I think it was a very smart thing to do. I think it's a lesson there for people to watch and learn from. TV wants good TV. That's the whole point of going down there. I sort of disagree with you slightly in so much as I think GB News will be disappointed with it. You've got somebody who was formerly in the cabinet, a former Home Secretary, going to somewhere where there's a protest. You are expecting fireworks. I'm sure Patrick Christys was thinking that, right? We will see fireworks. We're going to see great TV. And it's amusing. I was laughing while watching that, but it's not quote unquote great TV. It's more like I felt like I was watching an episode of The Office or something. You know, it was quite cringeworthy. So, yeah, I think it was very, very deftly handled by the students. And by the way, put that in stark contrast to where you've seen people screaming or chasing people down where they disagree with them. And look, it's a free country. You within reason, as long as you're not intimidating or harassing somebody, you can do that. You can very strongly disagree with somebody. You're allowed to do that. But my goodness, I think this is a pretty damn good way to deal with a politician like Suella Braverman. And it says a lot more. And the icing on the cake for me was when she went to the older gentleman and he just had that sign, again, very powerful message that he had there. This is how it's done.
Yeah, the discipline of it was, I think, what was really impressive. They'd clearly made a decision and they were all sticking to it, which is, we are not going to talk to her. And I think you are right, actually, Aaron. I think what they would have preferred is one, sort of to talk to one person, because obviously they're not going to play the most articulate interview they get, I don't think. I think they're going to be more inclined to play sort of the interview they think it's easiest to cast as unreasonable, because that's what they were looking for. And I think also what they want in those situations, as you sort of implied there, is for people to sort of shout FGB News and like someone to try and knock a camera out of someone's hand. That's when they sort of get to say, these people are extreme and they need to stop. So I do take your point that probably actually, even though it was very funny to watch, they were probably hoping for something a little bit more dramatic. Suella Braverman didn't then manage to speak to anyone at the Cambridge encampments, but she and GB News did manage to entice someone who'd taken part in protests elsewhere. This is into the GB News studio. Fiona Lally is National Campaign Coordinator for the Revolutionary Communist Party.
One of my first questions that I was very keen to ask, I mean, were you at the encampment?
The Cambridge one, but other ones.
Other ones, okay. And can I ask you what your view is of the events of October the 7th? What do you think happened on October the 7th in Israel?
Well, obviously the camps haven't started because of October the 7th specifically. Right. They're starting, this week in loads of encampments up and down the country. They've been celebrating and having to memorize the fact that this week commemorates the Nakba, which took place 76 years ago, which means catastrophe, which is a massive symbol of what Israel has been doing for the last 76 years. This isn't about October the 7th. And to start with that is just entirely disingenuous, I think, on your part. I really want to say that I think it's great, actually, that you went to that camp today and tried to talk to those students. And you kind of embarrassed yourself, I would say, whilst doing that, because it was a reminder for me, and I'm sure for other people watching, that actually the Palestine movement brought you down, and the Palestine movement has the potential to bring down lots of other Tory ministers and the whole Tory government, and not just the Tory government, I would say any government and any mainstream political party that is backing what Israel is doing right now, which is a genocide. And that's what people want to protest.
Do you want to... Suella Braverman, after just getting, very politely bodied, just like, okay, all right, yeah. Because it was she stayed really calm. I was actually surprised. I thought, going into the Lion's Den, that sort of Patrick Christys and Suella Braverman would have been a bit more provocative. It's sort of very sort of disarmingly calm in the studio, it seemed. But yeah, I thought that was a very good answer, saying this is not about October the 7th, talks about the Nakba, sort of really sort of saying this is why people care about this. And then, a kind of undeniable or, uncontroversial really dig at Suella Braverman, because I think, the guest was absolutely right. Most people watching that at home, maybe not GB News' core audience, but most people who watch it sort of afterwards or who are seeing this sort of on social media, they do think of Suella Braverman as kind of a loser politician who got brought down, who got kicked out of the cabinet for being just completely a complete idiot when it came to Palestine protesters, right? No one in the Conservative Party was defending her after what she did. And to sort of remind you, in case you had forgotten, so this controversy was when the Palestine demo, or the anti-Gaza war demo, was planned for the week, which happened to be when there was the Armistice Day. Now, this demo went nowhere near the cenotaph. It wasn't even on the day of the Armistice commemorations. But for some reason, Suella Braverman decided that she was going to kick up this huge stink and say that this should be cancelled. These are really dangerous people, sort of implying the cenotaph needs to be defended, even though the march was never going to go anywhere near that. That provoked a bunch of far-right people, including Tommy Robinson, to go and have a ruckus with the police there. The Palestine march was the most sort of peaceful, inspiring march I've ever been on, and I think many people have ever been on. It's absolutely enormous. She's sacked within a couple of days. So it was her idiocy with regard to the Palestine protest that brought her down. And I think that young person, that member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, brought that out very well. As you can imagine, with Fiona Lally being a revolutionary communist, the conversation did also move on to broader topics.
Let's talk about the broader context of this, which is Suella Braverman lecturing anyone about racism. I don't think is going to, I don't think anyone's going to listen to that, basically. You specifically and your government have been the architects of horrific racist policies and whipping. You're talking about hatred, you're talking about violence, you're talking about all of these terrible things. I was watching the thing today, you're saying war is a tragedy and all of this kind of stuff. First of all, capitalism produces all of that tragedy, produces racism, produces all these
I mean, I do wonder if that's the central point, isn't it? Is it? Look, I'll let you come on this, but there have been the allegations of racism there. But again, it is actually your main argument for you is you want to smash the capitalist system.
Absolutely, because capitalism produces war and produces imperialism, which fundamentally has been driving everything that's happened over the last 76 years. It isn't just about the last 7 months or anything like this. I'm entirely opposed to the capitalist system and the horrors that it produces across the world in many different places, but also in this country too. And that's what you support.
We could talk for hours about capitalism, but I would just point out, your trainers, your bracelet, everything you're wearing, the coffee you had this morning, the car you drove in,
workers,
the car you drove in today are all products of capitalism. We're in this studio. We're living in a free and democratic society because we're beneficiaries of capitalism, growth, enterprise and freedom.
No, the only people who benefit
it's really
from
interesting, and what I would challenge you to think about and reflect on is, as a beneficiary of capitalism, where you have a lot of luxury comparatively by global standards, you are actually undermining the very system that has brought millions of people, in fact, billions of people out of poverty around the world and brought education, good standards, good healthcare, clean water, education, fair treatment to girls,
5 million people,
housing
5 million
and wealth
children,
and prosperity to the world.
5 million children every single year die needlessly of malnutrition, of preventable diseases, and you sit here saying that it's bringing people into it. It is digressing because we're here to talk about the Palestine.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Now, I'm going to be controversial here, right? Because while throughout their debate about Palestine, I think Fiona Lally was nearly always absolutely correct and Suella Braverman was always completely, fundamentally wrong. On some of those broader points about capitalism, I do think Suella had a bit of a point, right? Now, don't switch off. Bear with me. I'm going to go to 2 data points sort of to try and bring you around to my position in case you're throwing stuff at the television. So Fiona Lally mentioned children dying unnecessarily under capitalism. Now, that is undoubtedly true, and it's a tragedy. It should be fixed, right? But Suella is right that a lot more children used to die before capitalism became the dominant system, right? So this is from Our World in Data, a great website. It shows that until 1800, child mortality, this is phenomenal, averaged 48%. So nearly half of children died before they were adults. Remarkably constant in hunter-gatherer societies, it was 49%. In ancient Rome, it was 50%. In Sweden, in the 1600s, it was 50%. In Japan, in the 17 and 1800s, 51%. Then after the Industrial Revolution, that massively declines. By 1950, global child mortality is at 27%. And then in 2020, global mortality for children is 4.3%. In some of the sort of more rich and equal countries, it's down to 0.3%. So rich and equal, but still fundamentally capitalist. Iceland, Finland, Norway, Japan. Poverty was also mentioned there. And in terms of extreme poverty, we can also tell a similar story. Again, this is from Our World in Data. In orange, it shows the share of the global population living in extreme poverty. That's defined as people unable to meet basic needs, including sufficient nutrition and adequately heated shelter. So the share fell from 75% in 1820 to around 10% in 2018. And the decline in extreme poverty has actually been accelerating in the last 2 decades. So you can see it sort of goes down at a moderate pace for most of the 20th century. And then in the 2000s, largely driven by China, which isn't it's not a neoliberal country, but it is a capitalist country. It goes much, much lower. Aaron, some people might think I'm committing blasphemy here, talking about how the capitalist system has brought a lot of people out of poverty and increased the health of children. Obviously, I'm a social democrat. I like capitalism with egalitarian characteristics. What's your response?
Well, it looks like we haven't been cancelled for a few weeks here at Navarran Media. So Michael Walker thought he'd stir the pot. Life was getting a little bit too easy, a little bit too comfortable. Look, I disagree with you. On the basics of what you're saying, it's obviously inarguable that infant mortality, women dying in childbirth has just has collapsed over the last 200 years across the world. It clearly maps onto what we might view as quote unquote development, rising literacy, rising GDP, rising productivity per worker, urbanization. Clearly, these all map onto one another. There is a transitional process which happens. It's called the demographic transition theory. That happens clearly, and it maps onto what happens with the Industrial Revolution. I would say a few things here. Firstly, and this is really remarkable, and we don't really talk about it enough, until the early 1800s, infant mortality was so high amongst humans. There were primates in the wild, there were other kinds of primate, like baboons, who had better rates of infant mortality than humans did, until about 200 years ago, which is mind-blowing. As a species, we've been around for 300,000 years. For almost all of that, we had a higher rate of infant mortality than most primates or a lot of other primates. That's a really interesting statistic when perhaps as a species we get, ideas above our station about how clever we are. Well, for a long time, our babies were more likely to die than with wild primates, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa and East and Southeast Asia. So that's the first point. Secondly, the young woman there said that, look, capitalism didn't create these things, workers did. And I would say the same in regards to the really important statistics you just referred to, Michael. For instance, the arrival of vaccines. Jenner does this with cowpox, an English farmer/scientist, agronomist/scientist. He develops the first vaccine. Those save, in the end, billions of people's lives, or let's say hundreds of millions of people's lives. Improve the quality of life for many, many people. Vaccines aren't an outgrowth of capitalist development. They're an outgrowth of human ingenuity. The insight of Marx, of course, is that capitalist society
why didn't it happen before then, though? So if you're saying the vaccine creation was just a product of human ingenuity, why didn't it happen for the previous 5,000 years until we had the Industrial Revolution, which I think it's difficult to deny was driven by capitalism?
Lots of things are down to human ingenuity. We could say numeracy, astronomy, mathematics, language, capturing fire. These are all outgrowths of human ingenuity. Nobody says, without the unique economic system that hunter-gatherers had, they would never have been able to come up with basic numeracy. Without the unique economic system of feudalism that they had in ancient Babylon, they never would have understood that there are 365 days in a year and various cosmological facts. So I'm slightly skeptical of that. What I would say is, and I disagree with you about capitalism, actually, Michael. I don't think it's capitalism. It's markets. And China is not a capitalist society. It's not. It's a market society. But there is a political impetus that's driven by the Chinese Communist Party, which is about promoting a certain kind of growth, achieving certain kind of political ambitions. And if you ask somebody in the CCP, they would say the main difference between us and what you have in the West is that the political ambitions that drive us are not the interests of capital. Our interests are taking 100 million people out of poverty. Our interests are being the world's number one in microprocessor production. Our priorities are, basically producing all the world's steel and being number one in these strategic industries. So we determine capital allocation, we determine problem solving within the parameters of market production, whereas you in the West, you don't have that level of coordination of resources. You allow capital to basically determine its own fate. Again, let's go back to Marx here. What is capital? Capital is value in motion. It's money making money. That is the supreme sort of political impetus that guides your societies. We're different. And what I would say is, in regards to what that young woman said, and I don't agree with everything she said, by the way, and I do agree with you that, look, the world's a lot better now than it was 250 years ago. I think that's because of a bunch of things. I would say the globalization of market society, for sure. Features of capitalism, although, of course, many of the good things that you're talking about are the result of state-led coordination. And that's not necessarily even, you could call it social democratic. I don't even think it's necessarily that. And to underscore that point, Michael, look at life expectancy today. China, Cuba, Turkey have a longer life expectancy than the United States. That's before you even look at certain demographics like African-American men who are far more likely to die at a younger age than the average US citizen. So, I think that undermines the argument that capitalism is really good for health outcomes. Or in Bosnia, women are less likely to die in childbirth in Bosnia than they are in the United States. I think that tells you something quite important, actually, about what capitalist development, high GDP, doesn't necessarily map onto impressive health indicators. So these two things go hand in hand. I think that's absolutely right, Michael, and I think we need to unpick that. I don't think it's monocausal. The idea that capitalism therefore leads to these really good outcomes on health, I don't buy that. India is a capitalist society. China is a capitalist society. And they've gone in very different directions on things like gender equality, life expectancy, extreme poverty. And so I fundamentally disagree with your assertions there about that's a capitalist society. It's a market society with a very, very unique political configuration, which I don't think any Western capitalist liberal democracy has.
Haven't you just changed definitions there? Because, I mean, I suppose the point I'm making is whatever you talk about, any country here or there, right? You've got to see that things have really changed since about 200 years ago. So even if you want to have a sort of Chinese state-led, I mean, I think it's state-led capitalism that they've got in China. I don't think when anyone calls themselves a sort of anti-capitalist, they're envisioning that you'll still have billionaires owning factories, but you'll also have a powerful communist party that can discipline them as and
you could call it market socialism.
It's got vast inequalities in China.
Sure.
And the thing, and this all happens in the context of something which changed 200 years ago. And you've said,
sure.
Oh, okay, that's globalized markets. But that just seems to me to be renaming capitalism. I don't think that young lady on GB News would say, oh, yeah, no, I'm in favor of globalized markets. I'm just not in favor of capitalism.
It's not Adam Smith writing The Wealth of Nations in 1770, whatever it is, and then that happening. There is a configuration of events, some technological, the arrival of the steam engine, some political, the American and French revolutions, some intellectual, yes, of course, people like Adam Smith, but it's like the idea of there's this new unique system called capitalism that makes everything better. No, the steam engine, Michael, creates extraordinary wealth to an extent we've never seen before. Could that have happened under a different kind of political system? Would it have developed in a different kind of way? Plausibly. You know, there's significant amounts of evidence that the Greeks around the 1st century AD and before then even were creating very sophisticated levels of technology. The point is, because they had a slave class, the incentives weren't there for them to develop it. You know, there is a very different counter-alternative world where actually the technologies we associate with the 19th century are existing by the 5th, 6th, 7th century. Or equally, you know, you have the analytic engine, which was developed by Charles Babbage in Victorian England, the world's first computer. That could have, you know, precipitated the information revolution 100 years before it actually started. That information revolution would look very different to the one that we saw over the course of the second half of the 20th century. So I think, of course, you can't ignore capitalism and the incentives it creates. Of course you can't, Michael. But the idea that all these changes come about as a result of capitalism, this new unique system, no, it's nonsensical. There's a ton of technological developments. There's a ton of changes in configurations of how we run society, i.e. the liberal constitutional revolutions of the late 18th century. You get the idea of a mass tax base in France to pay for the Grande Armée. All of a sudden that creates the possibility of an organized centralized state. So no, this idea that it's just capitalism, no. It would be an ensemble of maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 things. And yet you would probably say that capitalism / the globalization of market economies is one of them. But the idea that is the catalyst for all that stuff is I find silly.
You know, I know you're a Marxist, right? I think Marxists maybe have it both ways. So you sort of say, obviously the Marxist theory of history is to say that the fundamental thing that changed, you know, towards, you know, in the 17th and 18th, 19th centuries was we shifted dramatically to a capitalist system. And that is sort of the big explanatory feature of global history is capitalism. And then you list all these good things. You say, oh no, the good things, they come from different situations. The wars, they're driven by capitalism. But the fact that now we have higher life expectancies, we have vaccines, the fact that child mortality has shrunk, that's something else that just happened to coincide with the Industrial Revolution and development. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Well, I just don't buy that. Penicillin, for instance, was developed by somebody who literally didn't want to patent it. They gave it away to society. So the idea that the incentives behind penicillin, which has saved hundreds of millions of people's lives, that's just simply not true. And also, I think you're buying a myth, which is to say that no good stuff happened before the early 1800s. So, for instance, one of the things, and a lot of that good stuff only kicks in later on. So we're talking about improving life expectancy, the distribution of what we would think of as contemporary healthcare. You know, a lot of that stuff, of course, is impossible without the printing press and mass literacy. And if you want to sort of work out where that comes from and when that revolution happens, you have to go back to the typographic revolution in the 16th century. And it takes a long time before you get mass literacy and, of course, the ability of people to coordinate in the way that we're talking about here. But that's not just capitalism. That's building on a previous print revolution several hundred years earlier. So, this idea that, the world was absolutely fucking dog shit until the 1800s. Yes, infant mortality, very bad. And by the way, we do agree on some of this, by the way, Michael. If you look at the idea of privilege, Queen Anne, I think, was the queen in this country, early 18th century. She had 17 kids, I believe. She had 17 children. All of them died before the age of 10. So they either died in childbirth, or she had miscarriages, or one died, and I think he died at 10, right? He was the heir to the throne. That was an incredibly common experience for humanity until very recently, right? Just huge numbers of children dying before they reach adulthood, huge numbers. And also women dying in childbirth too. That's a massive, significant change. I will absolutely grant you that, of course, but I simply refute the idea that it's contingent on a certain kind of economic system. Let me invert this, Michael. Would we have climate change if we had a socialist economic, let's say the USSR somehow won the Cold War? Would we have climate change? Of course we would. Of course we would, because whether it was USSR and communism or the United States-led sort of brand of capitalism after World War II, whichever side won, they were still both burning fossil fuels. They still maintained a certain kind of relationship to nature where they viewed it, as something through which you extract value. So, I mean, I would say the same with regards to the technologies which emerged at the start of the 1800s. From vaccines all the way through, fast forward to the early 20th century. To antibiotics. The idea that that's contingent on a certain kind of economic system, I think, is as stupid as saying that we wouldn't have climate change if the USSR won. I think, no, that's just simply not true.
Yeah, I suppose I'd just say none of these things did happen before 1800. Child mortality, as I say, I didn't realize how constant it was. I knew that it sort of dramatically fell after the Industrial Revolution, but I'd thought it had been, probably maybe slowly declining until then. But it's basically 50% for the entirety of human history until the Industrial Revolution.
Let me. There are some things, Michael, where if you look at human population, so for instance, the Roman Empire is extraordinary for many things, but you don't get a city of 1 million inhabitants in Europe until London about 200 years ago, right? Rome in the first century has about 1 million people. That is not replicated again in Europe until 200 years ago. And there is a reason why, you had a view of history as Polybian cycles of going up and down rather than linear progress, because if you're looking back at Rome with 1 million people and you're in 16th century England or France or the Dutch Republic, you think, well, fucking hell, they were really kicking some backside. So fresh drinking water in first century Rome was better than it would have been in England, in London in the early 1900s. So it's more complicated than that. What I would say is after the early 1800s, you have the Industrial Revolution, you have this huge diffusion of knowledge. And also the population thing, Michael, is also about living longer. And by the way, people weren't living longer, and this is probably the best counter argument. People weren't living longer until well into the mid 19th century. Actually, people in the 30, 40 years into the Industrial Revolution were actually shorter and sort of had less muscle mass than they were before the Industrial Revolution. One of the reasons why you have the beginnings of welfarism in Germany, in France, in the UK, is because they recognize actually large numbers of their men aren't physically fit enough to fight wars. So on some measures, yes, infant mortality falls, maternal deaths and childbirth fall, but people get shorter, they're less physically healthy. And there's something called the Engels pause, which is you have the Industrial Revolution for 40, 50 years, and yet standards of living don't improve. They do improve eventually. Why? Collective action, industrial action, political resistance, which says, look, the pie's got bigger, but we want a bigger share of that bigger pie. So this sort of monocausal relationship that somebody like Suella Braverman would have between capitalism equals better living standards. Well, no, without the politics, without the trade unions, without the demands, without those movements, I mean, who knows? We don't have that counterfactual, but they did happen, thank God. And that's why we have the weekend, the 8-hour day and the welfare state.